The studio lights felt hotter than usual that night, the kind of heat that presses against the skin and makes every breath feel a little heavier. Clint Eastwood sat in the guest chair, posture straight, hands loosely folded, eyes calm but alert. At 90 plus, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen every version of the room he was in, every trick of charm, every ambush disguised as banter. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back behind the desk, smiling wide for the cameras, flipping through his cue cards with practiced ease. The audience applauded as the conversation began, the applause rolling like a wave and then settling into an expectant hush. Jimmy opened with warmth, praising Clint's legacy, the iconic films, the unmistakable presence. Clint nodded, offering a faint smile, the kind that suggested gratitude without indulgence. For a few minutes, it was smooth sailing, stories about directing, about how Hollywood had changed, about the discipline it took to keep making films when most people would have long since retired. But beneath the polished surface, something shifted. Jimmy tilted his head, tapping the desk lightly with his pen. "You've always been known for saying exactly what you think," he said, voice playful. "Some people say that's refreshing. Others say, well, maybe it's a little outdated." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience. Clint's smile faded, not abruptly, but deliberately. He looked at Jimmy, eyes steady, weighing the words. "Outdated," he repeated, tasting it. "Depends who's doing the judging." Jimmy chuckled, sensing the tension but pressing on. "I mean, Hollywood's changing. New voices, new rules. Do you ever feel like you don't quite fit into the modern conversation?" Clint shifted slightly in his chair. The movement was small, but the cameras caught it. "I've never tried to fit into conversations," he said evenly. "I try to tell stories. Good ones. The rest tends to sort itself out." The audience applauded again, louder this time. Jimmy smiled, but there was a glint in his eyes, something sharper than humor. "Sure, but some of your comments in the past have stirred up controversy. People say they felt dismissive. Do you regret any of that?" For the first time, Clint's jaw tightened. He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. "I regret when people stop listening to each other," he said. "I don't regret being honest." Jimmy leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Honesty's great. But do you think there's a responsibility, especially with your influence, to evolve with the times?" That word again, evolve. The studio seemed to hold its breath. Clint looked out toward the audience, then back at Jimmy. "Times evolve," he said slowly. "Human nature doesn't change as much as people like to think." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jimmy laughed lightly, but the laugh didn't reach his eyes. "So you don't think Hollywood needs to change?" Clint's eyebrows lifted slightly. "I think Hollywood changes every day," he replied. "Sometimes for the better. Sometimes because it's scared." That landed harder than Jimmy expected. The laughter this time was uncertain, scattered. Jimmy cleared his throat. "Scared of what?" "Of saying the wrong thing," Clint said. "Of telling the wrong story. Of trusting the audience." The air felt thick now. Jimmy shuffled his cards, then decided to push. "Some would say that's just an excuse to avoid accountability." Clint's gaze sharpened. "Accountability to who?" he asked. "A room full of strangers on the internet? Or the people who actually sit in theaters and watch the work?" The audience reacted with a mix of applause and gasps. Jimmy raised his hands slightly, half joking. "Hey, I'm just asking the questions people are thinking." Clint leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "That's always the line," he said. "It's a convenient one." Jimmy smiled tightly. "So you think interviews like this are unfair?" "I think," Clint replied, voice calm but firm, "that sometimes they're less about curiosity and more about cornering someone into a headline." For a split second, the studio went quiet. Even the band seemed to freeze. Jimmy's smile slipped, just a little. "Well, we're all here to entertain," he said. "That includes a little sparring." Clint nodded once. "Sparring implies respect," he said. "And rules." Jimmy's eyes flicked to the camera, then back to Clint. "Are you saying I'm being disrespectful?" Clint didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, then back up, meeting Jimmy's gaze head on. "I'm saying," he said, choosing each word carefully, "that I came here to talk about work. Not to defend my existence in a business I helped build." A sharp intake of breath could be heard from somewhere in the audience. Jimmy laughed, but it sounded brittle. "No one's questioning your existence, Clint. Just your relevance. That was the moment. Clint's chair creaked softly as he leaned forward, placing his hands on the arms. His expression didn't explode into anger, it hardened into something colder, more resolute. Relevance, he said quietly, is earned over time. And it doesn't disappear because someone behind a desk decides it's inconvenient. The applause was immediate, thunderous. Jimmy tried to interject, but Clint continued, voice steady. I've spent my life doing the work. Letting the audience decide. I don't need a litmus test every time I speak. Jimmy opened his mouth, then closed it. The rhythm of the show was gone now, replaced by something raw and unpredictable. I think you're taking this a bit personally, he said, attempting a smile. Clint stood. The movement was unhurried, but decisive. The audience gasped, then erupted into noise. Clint adjusted his jacket, looked once more at Jimmy. When you've lived long enough, he said, you learn the difference between conversation and provocation. Jimmy stood halfway, hands raised. Clint, come on, sit down. We're just talking. Clint shook his head. No, he said simply. You're talking. I'm being poked. He turned slightly toward the audience, offering a small nod, more respectful than dramatic. I appreciate the invitation, he added. But I don't need to be here for this. Jimmy tried one last time, voice strained. You're really going to walk out? Clint looked back over his shoulder. I've walked out of worse scenes, he said. And with that, he stepped away from the chair, the cameras scrambling to follow as the crowd buzzed with shock, applause, and disbelief. The band hesitated, unsure whether to play. Jimmy stood frozen behind the desk, his late-night grin completely gone, as Clint Eastwood walked off the stage, leaving behind a silence louder than any punchline. Backstage, the air felt charged, like the aftermath of a sudden storm no one had predicted. Clint Eastwood moved down the narrow hallway with steady steps, his expression unreadable, his pace unhurried. A production assistant hovered a few feet behind him, clearly unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The muffled sound of the audience still echoed through the walls, applause mixing with confused chatter, the kind of noise that followed moments people knew they had just witnessed history, even if they didn't yet understand it. Behind him, on stage, Jimmy Kimmel stood frozen for a beat too long. The cameras remained live, red lights blinking like judgmental eyes. Jimmy cleared his throat, forcing a laugh that landed flat. Well, that just happened, he said, tapping his desk lightly as if the familiar rhythm of the show might magically return. The band offered a hesitant musical cue, then stopped when Jimmy raised a hand. He stared toward the exit Clint had taken, his smile now fully gone. In the control room, producers exchanged frantic looks. Headsets buzzed with overlapping voices, cut to commercial, stay wide, follow Jimmy, no, follow Clint. A director shouted instructions while a social media producer was already refreshing feeds, watching the moment explode in real time. Clips of Clint standing up, his final words, the sharp stillness before he walked away, each one was being clipped, captioned, and shared at lightning speed. Clint reached his dressing room and paused. He exhaled slowly, the tension finally loosening from his shoulders. Inside, the room was quiet, insulated from the chaos outside.